The Flanders mud in 1915 was not just earth and water. It was a living, consuming thing. It swallowed boots, it swallowed cartwheels, and sometimes it swallowed men whole. But for the soldiers of the German Imperial Army dug into the trenches opposite the 1st Canadian Division, the mud was the least of their worries. They were worried about the silence. In the chaotic symphony of the First World War, a war defined by the deafening roar of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, and the screams of the dying, silence was usually a blessing. It meant a reprieve. It meant you could eat your soup without shaking, or write a letter home to Berlin without dirt falling from the dugout ceiling. But in the sector facing the Canadians, the silence had become weaponized. It had become heavy, oppressive, and terrified. The German officers had started to notice a pattern. It began with the sentries. A young soldier would peer over the parapet at dawn, just for a second, to check the wire. There would be no crack of a rifle, no flash from the enemy line 300 yards away, just a soft thud, and the boy would slide back down into the trench, a neat, small hole through his forehead. Then it was the runners. Men carrying messages between command posts would vanish in the communication trenches, found hours later with a single bullet wound. Then the fear began to climb the chain of command. An officer, confident in his safety behind the lines, would light a cigarette in the twilight. The flare of the match would last for half a second. It was enough. The match would fall, and the officer would fall with it. The Germans were baffled. The distance was too great for standard rifle fire. The visibility was too poor, and the frequency was impossible. They weren't losing men to a platoon of shooters. The shots were coming from a single source. They were being hunted by a ghost. Intelligence reports began to circulate among the German high command in the Ypres salient. They spoke of a spirit in no man's land, a shooter who didn't follow the rules of European warfare, who could move through the mud without leaving a footprint, who could blend into a scorched tree stump or a pile of sandbags so perfectly that you could look right at him and see nothing but the war. The Germans called him many things, whispers of superstition from men living in a nightmare, but the Canadians knew him simply as Peggy. His real name was Francis Pegahmagabow, and he was not a ghost. He was something far more dangerous. He was an Ojibwe warrior from the Perry Island Band in Ontario, and he had brought the ancient, patient art of the hunt to the industrialized slaughter of the Western Front. To understand why Francis Pegahmagabow became the deadliest sniper of the First World War, and perhaps the most effective sniper in history relative to the technology he used, you have to understand who he was before the world went mad. Francis was not a soldier by trade. He was a marine fireman on the Great Lakes, a man of the water and the woods. He had grown up in the Shawanaga First Nation, raised by the elders who taught him the old ways. They taught him that the land speaks if you listen. They taught him that movement draws the eye, but stillness makes you invisible. They taught him that a hunter does not chase, a hunter waits. When the war broke out in 1914, Francis volunteered immediately. It was a bitter irony. He was fighting for a king and a country that did not legally consider him a citizen. As a status Indian, he was a ward of the state, treated like a child by the government, unable to vote, his life controlled by an Indian agent. Yet he signed up to die for the British Empire. He joined the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion and sailed for Europe, carrying with him a medicine bag, a pouch of dried herbs and protective charms given to him by an elder. He believed it would keep him safe. The men in his unit, mostly white boys from the cities and farms of Ontario, looked at the quiet, bronze-skinned man with curiosity. They didn't know that he possessed a skill set that would soon make him a legend. The weapon of the Canadian Army was the Ross rifle. History remembers it as a disaster. It was a finicky, over-engineered target rifle that was perfect for the shooting range, but terrible for the mud of the trenches. It jammed constantly. When it got dirty, the bolt would seize up. In the heat of rapid fire, it could blow back in a soldier's face. Most Canadian soldiers hated it, throwing them away the first chance they got to steal a British Lee Enfield. But Francis Pegahmagabow loved the Ross. He understood it. It was a precision instrument, accurate at long ranges if you treated it with respect. While other men cursed their jammed weapons, Francis cleaned his obsessively. He learned its quirks. He learned exactly how the wind played with the heavy .303 bullet. In his hands, the flawed Ross rifle became a scepter of death. The legend of Peggy began in earnest at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. This was the battle where the world changed forever. This was the battle where the Germans introduced poison gas. When the greenish-yellow cloud of chlorine gas drifted across the Canadian lines, choking the life out of French colonial troops and leaving a 4-mile gap in the Allied front, it was chaos. Men were drowning on dry land, their lungs filled with fluid. Panic threatened to rout the entire army. But amidst the coughing, burning hellscape, Francis Pegahmagabow held his ground. He tied a urine-soaked handkerchief around his face, a primitive gas mask, and kept shooting. While others retreated or lay dying, Francis was spotting targets in the haze. He wasn't just shooting. He was acting as a scout, running messages through the gas-choked trenches to coordinate the defense. He was everywhere at once. He fought for days without sleep, his eyes burning, his Ross rifle hot to the touch. After Ypres, the war settled into the grinding stalemate of trench warfare, and this was where Francis truly ascended. He didn't just stay in the trench. When night fell and the very lights, flares, popped overhead, casting long dancing shadows, Francis would slip over the parapet. This was no man's land, a zone of corpses, barbed wire, and craters filled with toxic water. For a normal soldier, entering no man's land was a suicide mission. For Francis, it was his office. He would crawl on his belly, moving inches at a time. He wore a modified uniform, dragging rags and mud to break up his outline. He would find a shell crater or the hollowed-out carcass of a horse and wait. He would wait for hours. He would wait for the sun to come up behind the German lines, blinding them while illuminating his targets. He would watch the German trenches like a hawk watching a field mouse. He learned the habits of his enemy. He learned when they relieved the sentries. He learned where the officers liked to drink their coffee. He learned the rhythm of their breathing. The German snipers, the Scharfschützen, were the best in Europe. They were equipped with high-quality optics and telescopic sights. Francis, for most of the war, used iron sights. He didn't need a scope. His eyes were the scope. He would spot the glint of a German lens, the slight movement of a helmet, or the puff of breath in the cold air. One specific duel, whispered about in the regiment, cemented his status. The Germans had brought in a specialist, a sniper hunter, to clear the sector of the Canadian Ghost. This German sniper was good. He was killing Canadian sentries, pinning them down. He was using a steel plate with a small loophole to fire from safety. Francis watched him for 2 days. He didn't fire. He just watched. He realized the German sniper had a habit. Every time he fired, he would open the loophole, take the shot, and then immediately close it. Francis crept out into no man's land under the cover of darkness. He positioned himself at an angle, dangerously close to the German wire. He waited. The sun rose. The German sniper opened his loophole to scan for a target. He saw nothing. He relaxed. He prepared to take a shot at a Canadian helmet propped up on a stick, a decoy Francis had arranged. As the German focused on the decoy, Francis exhaled. He didn't fire at the loophole. He fired through it. The bullet passed through the small steel opening and struck the German sniper in the eye. the threat was removed. By 1916, the German intelligence officers were obsessed. The kill count attributed to the sector held by the 1st Battalion was statistically impossible. They were losing officers at a rate that disrupted command and control. They began to shell the Canadian trenches blindly, just hoping to kill the sniper by chance. They sent patrols out at night specifically to find him. This is where the hunter becomes the hunted dynamic, turned truly terrifying. Francis didn't just hide from these patrols. He stalked them. There are accounts of German raiding parties moving silently through the mud, intent on capturing a Canadian trench, only to realize they were being trailed. One by one, the men at the back of the patrol would drop silently. Francis would emerge from the darkness, his trench knife drawn, or his rifle firing from point-blank range, then vanish again. He was terrified of being captured. He knew what they would do to the ghost, but he refused to stop. But the war was escalating. The Battle of the Somme was approaching. The industrial meat grinder was hungry, and even a ghost could bleed. Francis was wounded in the leg in 1916, but he refused to be evacuated to England. He returned to the battalion as soon as he could walk. He was promoted to corporal, a rare feat for an Indigenous man in a white man's army. But the medals, the military medal, and then a bar to it, didn't matter to him.
What mattered was the job.
As the war dragged into 1917, the terrain changed. The dry chalk of the Somme gave way to the clay of Passchendaele. This was the low point of humanity. The rain never stopped. The drainage systems of Flanders had been smashed by artillery, turning the battlefield into a swamp of liquid mud that was deep enough to drown a horse. It was here, in this brown ocean of despair, that Francis Pegahmagabow would face his greatest test. The Germans were dug into concrete pillboxes, immune to artillery, mowing down the Canadians as they waded through the slime. The ghost sniper could no longer rely on stealth alone. He had to become a warrior in the open. The German High Command had issued orders. The snipers must be eliminated. They had deployed their own elite units, the stormtroopers, trained in infiltration tactics. They were looking for him. They knew his unit. They knew his reputation. And in the mud of Passchendaele, there was nowhere left to hide. Here is part 2 of the script. Passchendaele was a graveyard of ambition. In the autumn of 1917, the British Empire poured men into a swamp of despair in a desperate attempt to break the German line. For the average infantryman, survival was a lottery. If you stepped off the wooden duckboards that wound through the morass like floating skeletons, you could sink to your waist in minutes. If the German artillery didn't kill you, the mud would suffocate you. But in this landscape, where technology and machinery bogged down and failed, the ancient skills of Francis Pegahmagabow became more vital than ever. The modern war had stopped working. It was now a primitive war of endurance. The German defenders were terrified of the nights in Passchendaele. The rain obscured everything, turning the world into a blurring gray sheet. But they knew he was out there. The reports from the German sector facing the 1st Canadian Battalion grew frantic. Sentries were vanishing, not shot, just gone. Francis wasn't just sniping anymore. The conditions were often too poor for long-range shooting, so he had switched roles. He had become the ultimate scout, the phantom in the mist. There is a specific account that illustrates the sheer audacity of the man during this period. The Canadian command needed to know the strength of a German strongpoint, a concrete pillbox that was chewing up the advancing infantry with machine gun fire. They asked for volunteers to scout it. Francis didn't volunteer. He simply vanished into the rain. He didn't take a squad. He moved alone. He crawled through the slurry, his body painted with mud, moving so slowly that he was indistinguishable from the thousands of corpses that littered the field. He reached the German trench line. Instead of just observing, Francis slipped inside. Imagine the scene: a German dugout lit by a flickering lantern. Officers huddled over a map, wet and miserable, believing they were safe behind their concrete walls and machine guns. And then, from the shadows of their own trench, a figure emerges. A man who looks like he was birthed from the mud itself, dark eyes burning, a pistol in one hand and a trench knife in the other. He didn't kill them, he captured them. Francis Pegahmagabow marched a string of terrified German prisoners back across no man's land to the Canadian lines. He delivered the intelligence, and the enemy soldiers cleaned his weapon and prepared to go back out. This wasn't an isolated incident. By the end of the war, Francis Pegahmagabow would be credited not just with 378 confirmed kills as a sniper, but with the capture of over 300 enemy soldiers. Think about that number. 300 men. That is more than 2 full companies of infantry. He captured them mostly alone, appearing out of the darkness like a spirit of vengeance, terrifying them into submission before they could raise their rifles. To the Germans, he wasn't a soldier. He was a demon who could walk through walls. But the war was taking its toll. The medicine bag he wore around his neck, the dried herbs and charms given to him by the elder back on Perry Island, was his psychological anchor. He believed deeply that it protected him. And looking at his record, it is hard to argue with him. He was at the Second Battle of Ypres, where the gas came. He was at the Somme, where the earth exploded. He was at Passchendaele, where men drowned in mud. He survived them all. He was wounded, yes, once in the leg, and later suffering from severe pneumonia, but he always returned. He seemed unkillable. However, the ghost was exhausted. By 1918, the war had become a war of movement again. The Germans launched their massive spring offensive, trying to win the war before the Americans arrived in force. Then the Allies counterattacked in the 100 Days Offensive. This was open warfare, fast and brutal. The trenches were left behind. The sniper's role changed. It wasn't about waiting for hours in a hide. It was about moving with the infantry, suppressing machine gun nests, and picking off officers to break the enemy's chain of command. At the Battle of the Scarpe in August 1918, Francis cemented his legacy. The Canadians were pushing hard, but they were pinned down. The German artillery was hammering their advance, and machine gun fire was raking the wheat fields. The attack was stalling. The officers were shouting, men were dying, and the momentum was breaking. In the confusion, Francis realized that the unit was running out of ammunition. Without bullets, the attack would fail, and the men would be slaughtered in the open. Francis didn't wait for orders. He didn't care about the shrapnel flying through the air or the machine gun bullets cutting the stalks of wheat around him. He ran. He ran back into no man's land, not to kill, but to save. He stripped ammunition from the bodies of the fallen, filling sacks with clips and bandoliers. He ran back and forth,
a solitary figure traversing the zone of death, resupplying his comrades while the ground erupted around him. He did this under heavy fire, ignoring his own safety entirely. For this action, and for his guidance in leading his company through the chaos, he was awarded a second bar to his military medal. He remains one of only 38 Canadians in the entire First World War to receive the military medal with 2 bars. It is an honor equivalent to winning the medal 3 separate times. He was, by the end of the war, the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the silence that fell over the Western Front was the first true silence Francis had heard in 4 years. The guns stopped. The hunting was over. The ghost could finally rest. He had done his duty. He had served the king. He had killed 378 enemy soldiers confirmed, though the real number was likely much higher, as many kills in the chaos of battle went unrecorded. He had proven himself to be one of the deadliest warriors the world had ever seen. He boarded the ship back to Canada a hero. The newspapers ran stories about Peggy, the legendary Indian sniper. He stood on the deck, looking west toward the Atlantic, perhaps imagining the welcome he would receive. He imagined returning to his people, respected, honored, a citizen of the empire he had helped save. But the Canada that Francis Pegahmagabow returned to was not the Canada he had fought for. The tragedy of Francis Pegahmagabow is not what happened in the trenches. It is what happened when he came home. He stepped off the train in Ontario, his chest heavy with medals, a war hero who had walked through hell. But the moment he took off his uniform, he ceased to be a hero in the eyes of the Canadian government. He became once again just an Indian. He returned to the Perry Island Reserve, expecting to restart his life. But he found that the Department of Indian Affairs controlled his every move.
The Indian agent, a government bureaucrat assigned to manage the reserve, was a tyrant. Francis, the man who had outsmarted the German Imperial Army for 4 years, was now told he couldn't leave the reserve without a pass. He couldn't vote. He couldn't buy land. He couldn't even have a beer with his fellow veterans at the local Legion Hall because it was illegal to sell alcohol to a status Indian. The injustice was staggering. Francis had commanded men in battle. He had been responsible for the lives of hundreds. He had been trusted with the most dangerous missions the Army could dream of. Yet, back home, the government treated him like a child. When he applied for a loan to buy a farm, a loan that was being given freely to white veterans, he was denied. The Indian agent declared that Francis was difficult and mentally unstable because he refused to bow his head and accept his second-class status. But the Germans had learned a hard lesson in the trenches. You do not back Francis Pegahmagabow into a corner. You do not try to suppress the ghost. Francis took the fighting spirit he had honed in Flanders and turned it against the Canadian government. He became a political warrior. He was elected chief of the Perry Island Band. He didn't use a rifle this time. He used his voice and his pen. He wrote furious letters to Ottawa, demanding that the government honor its treaties. He demanded the right for his people to control their own land, their own money, and their own destiny. The government tried to crush him. The Indian agent tried to depose him as chief, labeling him a troublemaker. They tried to use his war record against him, claiming his shell shock made him unfit to lead. But Francis wouldn't break. He traveled to Ottawa to lobby politicians. He joined with other Indigenous leaders to form the early national organizations that would eventually fight for Indigenous rights in Canada. He fought for the rest of his life, with the same patience and intensity he had shown in no man's land. He was sniping at the bureaucracy, looking for the weak points in the system, trying to create a breach for his people to move through. Francis Pegahmagabow died in 1952 at the age of 61. He died of a heart attack, his body finally giving out after years of struggle, first against the Germans and then against his own country. He died relatively poor, marginalized by the state he had defended. For decades, his story was largely forgotten by the mainstream public, just another dusty footnote in the archives of the Great War. But a ghost never truly disappears. In recent years, the fog has lifted. Canada has begun to remember. In 2016, a life-sized bronze statue of Francis Pegahmagabow was unveiled in Parry Sound, Ontario. It does not show him as a victim. It shows him as he was, a warrior. He is standing tall, his Ross rifle in one hand, a caribou at his feet representing his clan, and an eagle on his shoulder representing his spirit. He looks out over the land, his eyes fixed on the horizon, eternally vigilant. The Germans called him a ghost because they couldn't see him until it was too late. They feared him because he represented a force of nature they couldn't control. But looking back now, we see the truth.
Francis Pegahmagabow wasn't a ghost. He was a man of flesh and blood, of immense courage and tragic complexity. He was a man who walked into the fire of the 20th century armed with the skills of his ancestors, defeated the finest army in Europe, and then came home to fight the hardest battle of all, the battle for dignity. When you look at the history of World War I, you see millions of men ground up by the machine. But amidst the gray anonymity of the trenches, one figure stands apart. A man moving silently through the mud, iron sights raised, breathing slowly. The Germans spent 4 years hunting him. The Canadian government spent 30 years trying to silence him. They both failed.
Francis Pegahmagabow is still here, and his legend, like the man himself, refuses to die.